Mom and stepdad asks me to have S**X with the stepdad. She is a piece of crap for allowing and enabling such behavior. When we think of family, it's often with warmth and safety, a sanctuary from the chaos of the world. But what happens when that sanctuary turns into a prison, and those who are supposed to protect us betray us in unimaginable ways? This is a story of a young woman who found herself facing not only betrayal from her closest family but an unthinkable request that would test her strength and resilience. Hers is a journey not just of survival but of fighting for her own dignity and the safety of her younger siblings. Our story begins in an ordinary setting, but quickly it transforms into something nightmarish. At the heart of it is a young woman, let's call her Sarah, who grew up in a seemingly typical family. Sarah's mother had her at a young age, and her father, a college student, tragically passed away when she was still a baby. Life continued, as it often does, and eventually, Sarah's mother remarried, finding new love and stability in Scott. Her stepfather, Scott, to Sarah's young eyes, seemed like an ideal father figure, someone who cared for her as if she were his own daughter. For years, he filled a gap left by her father's absence, creating the illusion of a family bound together by love and mutual respect. But illusions can be deceptive. Beneath the surface, the reality was far more sinister. As Sarah grew older, she began to notice subtle shifts in Scott's behavior. These were slight changes, small, seemingly innocuous gestures that slowly began to cross the boundary of parental affection. At first, Scott would be a little too friendly, his touches lingering a bit too long, and his comments crossing into territory that made Sarah uncomfortable. He began offering her wine, asking her personal questions about her life, and slowly breaking down the walls of what should have been a respectful father-daughter relationship. Initially, Sarah brushed it off. It's not uncommon for parents to ask personal questions, sometimes even crossing boundaries in an attempt to connect. But Scott's behavior didn't stop there. The turning point came when, after an evening of drinking, Scott attempted to kiss her. Horrified, Sarah confided in her mother, expecting protection, comfort, and, most importantly, action. Instead, her mother dismissed it with a laugh, saying, "That's just how he gets after a few drinks." This response cut deeply. For Sarah, this wasn't just a minor issue, it was a serious breach of trust. A violation that should have been met with concern and anger, not casual dismissal. She realized then that her mother's loyalty to Scott outweighed her concern for Sarah's well-being. With her trust shattered, Sarah began to see her home not as a refuge but as a place she needed to escape from. She started saving money, making plans to move out and create a life where she could feel safe. Things were tense but quiet for a while. Sarah managed to keep her head down and focus on her goal of leaving. But just as she began to see a way out, life threw her another curveball. Her mother became pregnant with a high-risk pregnancy, which required her to spend most of her time on bed rest. This situation intensified Scott's inappropriate behavior. One evening, as Sarah sat down with her mother and Scott, they made a request that left her speechless. With her mother sitting beside him, Scott explained that due to the pregnancy, the doctor had advised her mother to avoid intimate relations. Then, with an air of nonchalance that seemed surreal, they asked Sarah if she would help Scott by fulfilling his needs until her mother could resume their marital relations. To add to the horror, her mother chimed in to assure her that it was perfectly acceptable and that she would even be in the room to make it less uncomfortable. This request was a violation of the most basic principles of familial love and trust. Sarah felt not only betrayed but disgusted and violated in ways she could scarcely express. How could the very people who were supposed to protect her ask such a thing? She refused outright, but the incident left her in shock, and she found herself questioning everything about her family and the people in her life. What makes a betrayal like this so devastating is that it forces a person to question their entire reality. Sarah had spent her life believing in her family's love and support. Now, in one horrifying moment, that foundation had crumbled, leaving her isolated and trapped in a nightmare. She was forced to confront the painful truth. Her mother and Scott did not see her as a daughter or even as a person worthy of respect but as an object to be used at their convenience. Sarah's situation is not an isolated one. Many people experience similar forms of manipulation and coercion in their families, often masked as requests for help or as cultural norms. Stories of individuals coerced into situations that serve the interests of manipulative family members are disturbingly common. For example, in some traditional households, children are expected to sacrifice their own needs for the sake of family honor or financial support, even if it means enduring exploitation or abuse. Such expectations are often justified under the guise of family loyalty, making it difficult for victims to recognize that they have the right to set boundaries and refuse. Sarah's case highlights an especially toxic form of manipulation where the line between family duty and personal violation is blurred, leaving the victim feeling responsible for the well-being of those who are supposed to protect them. This manipulation often leads to a profound sense of guilt, making it even harder for the victim to seek help or break free from the situation. But Sarah's concern wasn't only for herself. She worried deeply about her younger sisters, who were still innocent and unaware of the darkness that lurked in their family. Her instinct was to protect them from any possibility of experiencing what she had endured. The thought of her sisters facing the same coercion was unbearable, and Sarah knew she had to act. She confided in her aunt, who had always been a source of support and understanding. The aunt, horrified, immediately called Child Protective Services, hoping to intervene and protect Sarah and her sisters. However, the intervention was not straightforward, since Scott had not shown any inappropriate behavior toward the younger siblings. Child Protective Services couldn't take immediate action, but her aunt, unwilling to let the matter rest, encouraged Sarah to gather as much evidence as possible and be prepared to call for help again if needed. In the meantime, Sarah faced the impossible task of explaining the situation to her sisters. How could she tell them about the depravity in their own home without shattering their sense of security? And how could she do it in a way that didn't alienate them from her? She struggled with these questions, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. Ultimately, Sarah decided to share her concerns with her older sister, hoping that she would understand and be vigilant for any signs of inappropriate behavior. This conversation, while difficult, opened the door for her sisters to confide in her if they ever felt uncomfortable. It was a courageous act, one that showed Sarah's determination to protect her siblings, even if it meant facing painful truths. Eventually, the situation reached a tipping point. Sarah's aunt, along with other family members, staged an intervention. They arrived at the house to confront Scott and Sarah's mother, intending to take the younger siblings away to a safer environment. However, Scott reacted by calling the police, accusing them of trespassing. The confrontation was intense, and while it didn't end with immediate results, it planted a seed of doubt and concern in the minds of Sarah's sisters. Later, when they confronted Scott about his behavior, he shockingly didn't deny the accusations. This revelation was enough to convince the sisters to leave with their aunt and grandparents, who vowed to protect them from further harm. Despite the painful estrangement, Sarah and her siblings began to rebuild their lives with their extended family. Her aunt and grandparents provided a loving and supportive environment, helping them heal from the trauma they had endured. Sarah's journey, though far from easy, was a testament to her resilience and her commitment to safeguarding her sisters' futures. My stepdaughter wants her real dad to give her away, even though he breaks her heart by skipping town and breaking promises he makes to her. The story of betrayal isn't always obvious when it first begins. For one man, whom we'll call Mark, it started in small ways. There were the moments he felt left out of family conversations, the subtle shifts in attitude from his stepdaughter, who had once seen him as a father figure, and the growing detachment from his longtime partner, whom he hadn't married yet but had committed to for over a decade. Mark had invested in his stepdaughter, both emotionally and financially, watching her grow up, supporting her dreams, and giving her the best education he could afford. He thought of her as his own, but he was about to discover that sometimes loyalty isn't reciprocated. From the start, Mark hadn't expected the road to be easy. He entered his partner's life when her daughter, Emma, was a young teenager. They shared many good memories. Emma excelled in school, and though she occasionally had conflicts typical of any family, Mark always thought their bond was special. He had taken on the role of a father without hesitation and felt joy in seeing her become a capable young woman. He paid for her education at a good state university, even purchasing a car to ease her commute. To him, these gestures were natural. He had assumed he was building a lifelong bond with her. But there was a shadow in Emma's life, her biological father. Though he had largely been absent, only appearing sporadically to make promises he seldom kept, Emma's desire for his approval was undeniable. No matter how many times he disappointed her, she still held on to the idea of him as her real father. Mark, however, never interfered. He understood that every child yearns for the affection of their biological parents, no matter the circumstances. But he did hope, in the quiet moments, that perhaps Emma would eventually come to see him as the father who was always there, rather than the one who vanished repeatedly. As Emma's wedding day approached, Mark expected to play a significant role. After all, he had been by her side during every milestone. But the signs of his exclusion began to appear in subtle ways. When the wedding guest list was finalized, he was told that none of his 20 friends and family members could be invited due to space limitations. Then, he discovered that he hadn't even been listed on the wedding invitation. Emma's father was given the honor of father of the bride. His name featured prominently alongside her mother's, while Mark's role and contributions were omitted entirely. This discovery ignited a deep hurt in Mark's heart. He approached his partner to discuss the matter. But instead of understanding, she dismissed his feelings. She suggested that maybe they could find a few last-minute spots for his guests if others failed to RSVP. As though he were an afterthought. For Mark, this was a painful reminder that, in their eyes, he was little more than an ATM, a financial provider, not a valued member of the family. Then came the dinner that changed everything. Emma announced that her real dad would not only be attending the wedding but would also be giving her away. The news was met with cheers from her family, leaving Mark feeling invisible in a room filled with people who owed much to his generosity. That night, he felt a mix of betrayal, anger, and grief. He realized he had built a life around people who didn't respect him, people who had taken his kindness for granted. Gathering his composure, Mark decided to raise a toast. He knew he couldn't hold his emotions in any longer. Standing up, he expressed his gratitude for the clarity that Emma and her mother had given him regarding his role in their lives. In a moment of intense vulnerability, he shared how he had come to understand his position, not as a father, but as a source of financial support, a role he was now relinquishing. He ended his speech by announcing that he would no longer be financially contributing to the wedding or any other expenses they had counted on him for. Emma and her mother sat in stunned silence, and the rest of the guests were too shocked to react. That night, Mark withdrew the remaining money from the joint account he shared with his partner, effectively ending his financial obligations to them. He contacted the wedding vendors he had booked, canceling each service and asking for refunds. He knew there would be repercussions, but the decision brought him a sense of liberation he hadn't felt in years. The aftermath was turbulent. His partner accused him of being selfish, of ruining their daughter's special day. But Mark knew this was far deeper than the wedding. This was about respect, self-worth, and reclaiming a sense of dignity. In the days that followed, he asked his partner and Emma to move out. It was one of the hardest decisions he had ever made, but he felt a strange sense of peace in doing so. His house, now empty of the family he had once cherished, began to feel like a sanctuary rather than a place of betrayal. As Mark reflected on his journey, he realized the importance of self-respect and boundaries. He had given selflessly, but in doing so, he had also allowed himself to be taken for granted. He learned that love and support should be given freely but should never come at the cost of one's own dignity. He thought back to his own family, who had taught him that respect is mutual, that true family is built on love, trust, and appreciation, not just biology or convenience. In the weeks that followed, Mark began rebuilding his life. He reconnected with old friends, took up hobbies he had neglected, and found solace in the small joys he had once overlooked. The process was slow, but with each passing day, he felt stronger and more resilient. His experience had given him a new perspective on relationships. He had learned that sometimes, the people closest to us can be the ones who teach us the hardest lessons. And that's okay. What matters is that we take those lessons to heart and use them to shape a better, more authentic life. Mark's journey serves as a reminder that self-respect should never be compromised. No matter how deeply we love someone, family is not defined by blood or years spent together but by the respect, trust, and love we share. And sometimes, It's only by letting go of what no longer serves us that we can make room for the people and experiences that truly enrich our lives. I hate her for not allowing my mother to bring her boyfriend I don't know or want to know to my wedding. The wedding day was approaching faster than I prepared for. All the excitement, stress, and nerves culminated in countless little decisions to be made, with one lingering choice casting a shadow over the whole event. It wasn't the flowers, the venue, or even the dreaded guest list. No, it was about one person who sat right at the crossroads of my life, my mother. While most people wrestle with last-minute plans, their biggest worry is perhaps about the weather or a forgotten ring. But for me, it was the matter of allowing or denying my mother's latest boyfriend at my wedding. It seems trivial on the surface, like an issue that should be easily resolved. Yet, that decision embodied a lifetime of boundaries I'd had to build around her. The invisible walls that had grown with each year. These walls weren't just about a wedding or a single event. They were about who I was becoming as an adult and what I was willing to accept in my life moving forward. For context, I'd always had a complex relationship with my mother, Melissa. She was a woman of charisma, known for her light-hearted charm and infectious laughter that seemed to captivate everyone around her. But growing up, I came to realize that beneath that charm was a woman who prized love, her love life. To be exact, above everything else, including me. That was a painful realization to process. It wasn't that she was a bad mother, she provided for me and never missed the big moments. But in those quiet spaces in between, she was distant, always distracted by the next romance that swept her off her feet. After she left my father when I was 7, it didn't take her long to introduce a new figure into our lives. His name was Mark, and to my young mind, he was a beacon of stability. He was the first of her partners who felt like family to me. Mark tried his best to be a father figure. And for a while, we were a close-knit trio. But when I was 16, that bond was shattered. The divorce from Mark came as suddenly as their union, and I found myself back with my dad and his new wife. A stable figure in a way my mother had never been. Even as an adult, I chose to keep Mark in my life. I attended his wedding to a wonderful woman who welcomed me into their family. My father and stepmother had been steady pillars for me through every heartbreak and loss that defined my young adulthood. Meanwhile, my mother's love life spiraled through relationships that seemed to follow a repeating cycle. Each new partner was the love of her life, until he wasn't, and she'd move on to someone else. It became a predictable pattern, a pattern that left a mark on me as I grew up. Her choices in partners were also questionable. Many were much younger, some even close to my age. This trend only intensified the discomfort I felt about her relationships, making it harder to want to connect with her. It felt as if every boyfriend she introduced into my life was a reflection of her own restless heart. Her desire to prove that she could still capture youth's attention. Fast forward to the present. I was now 33, preparing for a small, intimate backyard wedding with my partner of 10 years. We wanted the ceremony to be simple. A gathering of around 40 of our closest friends and family in the rural countryside we both loved. My father and stepmother were thrilled, as was my stepfather, Mark. But when my mother asked if she could bring her current boyfriend, I immediately felt a wave of discomfort. I didn't know him, nor did I want to. I'd spent my whole life keeping her revolving door of partners at arm's length. And I wasn't about to break that boundary on one of the most important days of my life. She pressed me, offering to bring him by for an introduction beforehand. I hesitated. It wasn't that I didn't want her to be happy or even that I resented her relationships. But I didn't want to open that door again, especially not on my wedding day. I couldn't escape the memories of her asking me to accept boyfriend after boyfriend as family, only to watch them disappear as quickly as they'd arrived. I had no interest in making small talk with someone I knew wouldn't be around for the long haul. After I declined her offer, things quickly escalated. She called me, her voice filled with hurt and anger, telling me it was unfair that my father and Mark were allowed to bring their spouses while she was denied. I tried to explain that I had known their partners for years, that they were part of my life in ways her boyfriends never were. She shot back, demanding to know why I was so resistant to meeting her current partner, accusing me of being judgmental and unreasonable. And that's when I had to be honest with her. I told her that I didn't see the point. I knew her track record, and I wasn't interested in pretending otherwise. In my eyes, this relationship was no different than the others. Another chapter in the endless book of her search for love. This only made her more upset. She cried, accused me of judging her unfairly, and claimed I was treating her as if she were lesser, somehow. She brought up how much this new boyfriend meant to her, how he made her feel safe and loved in a way she hadn't felt in years. And then, she said something that struck a nerve. She told me that being around my father and stepfather, both happily married to wonderful women, made her feel isolated, and she needed someone by her side to face that. I understood her vulnerability in that moment, but my resolve didn't waver. This wasn't about her insecurities or her desire for a companion. It was about me and the boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish. After our call, I felt torn. On one hand, I wanted to accommodate her, to allow her this comfort for the day. But on the other hand, I knew I'd resent the intrusion. I shared my concerns with my fiancé, and even with my sister, who had witnessed my mother's behavior over the years. They both suggested I let her bring him, just for the sake of peace, just for one day. Yet, the more I thought about it, the more I realized this was about more than just one day. It was about honoring the person I had grown into, the adult who had set boundaries to protect myself. I made the decision to let her bring him, but with clear conditions. He would attend as her +1, not as a stepfather or any significant title. He would not be included in family photos, and he would not approach me at any point during the ceremony. I knew this was a compromise, but it was one I could live with. I relayed these conditions to my mother, and she reluctantly agreed. Although I could sense her disappointment, I reminded her of why I had set these boundaries in the first place, recalling how I had spent years being dragged into her relationship drama, always forced to take part in her endless quest for love, at the expense of my own emotional stability. As the wedding day approached, I found myself reflecting on my own journey and the lessons I had learned. I realized that while my mother's actions had often hurt me, they had also shaped me in profound ways. They taught me the importance of self-respect, of understanding where to draw the line and how to protect my own heart. And as I stood there, exchanging vows with the love of my life, surrounded by the family I had chosen, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I had honored my boundaries, my values, and in doing so, I felt ready to start this new chapter with a clear heart. My mother arrived with her boyfriend, and while it was an awkward arrangement, I could see that she was trying her best to respect my wishes. She kept to herself, staying by his side and not intruding on my moments. It was a reminder that sometimes, setting boundaries with family isn't about pushing them away, it's about creating a space where you can coexist peacefully, without resentment or regret. In the end, the wedding was everything I had hoped for. It was a celebration of love, not just between me and my partner, but also the love I had found for myself. I left that day knowing I had done the right thing, not just for myself, but for everyone involved. Looking back, I hope this experience might inspire others facing similar family challenges to honor their boundaries and prioritize their well-being.